Hello and welcome. My name is Lisa Dornell and I am a retired United States immigration judge. I currently serve as a commissioner on the ABA's Commission on Immigration, and I am pleased to be your moderator today as we present a timely webinar entitled Spanning the Divide, examining mass migration at the US border, southern border, through the lens of the film, A Bridge Apart. The film, A Bridge Apart, was written and produced by the late Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, Virginia Woolf, who devoted much of her life's work to bringing attention to important social and humanitarian matters, including the factors that motivate people to leave their homes to undertake a perilous journey to the United States. I hope that you have all had an opportunity to view the film. If not, we encourage you to do so after today's program. After today's program, the film will be available to view for a small fee on Amazon Prime. This webinar is sponsored by the ABA's Commission on Immigration and by the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. Our panel today will address the push and pull factors that influence mass migration and will analyze variables such as political, environmental, and social factors that motivate migrants to leave their homes. We'll explore the impact that our domestic policies have on migration patterns and delve into some possible solutions that might enable people to remain in their home countries with dignity and with sufficient resources to sustain themselves and their families. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A function, not through the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We're going to address questions at the end of the program, and we will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks, which we greatly encourage. That said, it is my privilege to introduce our panelists for today's program. Joining us today is Meg O'Brien Barrett. She is a co-producer of the film, A Bridge Apart. Raquel Aldana has joined us. She is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis. And with us today is Oscar Chacon, who is the co-founder and the executive director of Alianza Americas. And also joining us is Ragini Shah, the clinical professor of law at the Suffolk University Law School. To our panelists, thank you all so very much for being here today. We're going to begin by having our panelists describe either their direct connection to the film, A Bridge Apart, or their involvement in immigration projects or programs through their organizations or institutions. We're going to start first by hearing from co-producer of the film, Meg Barrett. Meg, would you briefly describe your involvement with the production of this compelling film?
I'd be happy to welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Judge Dornell, for this opportunity to join you today. I'm sorry about that. It helps to turn on the video. Hello, everyone, and Judge Dornell, thank you so much for asking me to join you today on the panel, and especially thank you so very much for bringing attention to this issue of immigration and migration from Central America through the prism of the film A Bridge Apart. I was a co-producer on the film, A Bridge Apart, whose primary creator, of course, was Virginia Woolf, Ginger, as we knew her affectionately. She was, as Judge Dornell mentioned, a multi-Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. And she, along with her professional partner, Frank Maniglia, the cinematographer, took, in essence, almost 5 years to complete this film. As most people in the documentary film universe will understand, that involves concept to development, fundraising, production, shooting, post-production, etc. In addition to helping to produce the film, I was a technical advisor on the project, managing logistics throughout Central America, parts of Arizona, Mexico, and in Metro Washington, D.C. Personally, I came to understand the issues of immigration and migration through my work at Catholic Relief Services, which is an international relief and development agency, economic development agency, serves about 140 million people across the globe in 115 countries. They have a very wide-ranging, deep partnership with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, community actors and stakeholders, and many, many, many farmers throughout Central America. So what I tried to share through the film and through Virginia Woolf's great effort was what we came to understand about the causes of migration and what solutions could be brought to bear to mitigate migration from Central America. I'd spent more than a decade working and traveling to Central America, witnessing these push and pull factors of immigration from that region, specifically from the Northern Triangle. And equally important to understand and witness the viable solutions in economic development, which, as I said, could mitigate the need for people to migrate. I'd like to share a little bit about Ginger Wolf's participation and the fact that she's not here today to speak on behalf of the film. Unfortunately, Ginger died of cancer a couple of years ago. She endeavored to complete this film through her fight with cancer, which she ultimately lost, but she was so very committed to it, having begun her understanding and the journey of making the film back in 2007 through 2012. We both wanted to raise awareness of the issue using, well, her considerable talents and her network to broaden the understanding of immigration and migration from Central America. In told, if you've seen the film, you understand, and if you haven't, you'll be interested to know that the film explains the need for communities to enjoy the basics to sustain healthy lives and livelihoods, to keep families together, which includes simple things like sophisticated but elementary at the same time water systems that provide health and irrigation, and jobs which provide a decent wage to sustain a family, along with the expectation of good governance and a reasonable expectation of protection from rampant violence and protection from law enforcement. Many of the immigrants that come from Central America don't enjoy any of these benefits. So we are pleased that you are interested in the film. We're pleased that we're going to be able to speak more to it today. Some of the call to action, I like to say, of things that you might be able to do to get involved in your communities and with your legislators. And with that, I'll hand it back to Judge Dornell. Thank you.
Meg, thank you for providing us with that important background. Next, let's hear from Raquel Aldana. What can you tell us about your involvement and your connection to these migration issues?
Well, let me begin by thanking you, Judge Dornell and Meg Barrett, and I wish I would have been able to thank Ginger as well for making this really important film. Part of my connection to the film is very personal. I was part of the forced migration phenomena of the 1980s, who first fled as a child with her family from El Salvador to Guatemala in 1980, and then subsequently from Guatemala to the United States in direct response to the civil wars that were intensifying in the region. I was 8 when I left El Salvador and 10 when I left Guatemala, my father's birthplace. So unlike the unaccompanied minors featured in the film and the adults traveling alone or with family, whose stories made me tear up, I came with my family legally through a church-sponsored visa, which should have been eligible for asylum, but the door then, as it is now, was shut down to Central Americans for a host of political reasons that had largely to do with US support for the undemocratic and despotic regimes in power in the region at the time. So I fully recognize today how close and yet how far apart my own story relates to the Central American migrants featured in the film. My parents' access to the church, a conservative evangelical church at that, gave us a path to legal immigration to the US as a family unit, which 100% explains not only the ways in which my journey was spared the trauma of crossing across Mexico, which is something my mother had contemplated, but also facilitated my social integration in the US. Professionally, almost immediately after law school, I became a human rights lawyer, working with the Center for Justice and International Law in Washington, D.C. And there I litigated cases of gross human rights violations, including atrocities committed during the civil wars of Central America before international tribunals. We were litigating these cases when these nations were transitioning to peace and engaging in Herculean efforts to embed the past with accountability, but also to address the root causes of the civil wars, which ironically are also the root causes of forced migration then and today. So as an academic, I also relate to the film in my efforts to elevate the voices of vulnerable Central Americans in ways that call for deeper reflections about the structural causes that not only explain the civil wars of Central America, but also the phenomena of chronic forced migration from the region north. One example of my scholarship that ties directly to the film is a book titled From Extraction to Emancipation, Development Reimagined, which was published both by the ABA and the Caroline Academic Press in 2018. This book emerged from a study space during which an academic community known as LACRIT invited a group of 18 scholars to Guatemala to explore themes of extractive industries and exploitative practices in the country, and to imagine how to radically shift the framework of policies of trade, foreign investment, labor, corporate social responsibility, deforestation, climate change adaptation, and migration, to name a few, to offer the beautiful people in those nations a right to live dignified lives at home. So I was very glad to see the film and trying to feature some successful models of how to get us there. And I look forward to engaging more in this conversation today. Thank you.
Raquel, thank you for sharing such a moving and personal account of your experiences. And I want to point out that links to the scholarship that she mentioned are available as a part of this webinar. We're going to hear next from Oscar Chacon, who, if you had an opportunity to view the film, is actually featured in the film. Oscar?
Thank you very much, Judge Darnell. It's a pleasure to be in this great company tonight. I have to say that my connection to the film obviously goes back to Ginger. She's the one that actually reached out to me, likely at the suggestion of my friends at Catholic Relief Services, to interview, for the film. And I have to say that the last time I had actually direct contact with Ginger was back in 2013. So it's a while back. And I was commenting to some of our co-panelists in this event that a lot of what I said in that particular instance, when I was interviewing for the film many years ago, sadly remains true today. I should point out that I am Salvadorian. I was born and raised in El Salvador. I arrived to the US when I was 17 years old. And, at the time I never really paid attention to it, but I was part already back in the year 2000 to the so-called unaccompanied minors. I mean, I came to the US by myself. I did not consider myself a minor at 17. I consider myself a full-blown adult just because of the life experiences I had faced in El Salvador. I did not leave El Salvador because I woke up one day and I said, oh, I don't like this country anymore and I better move to the US. I had to flee El Salvador because of political persecution. I had become involved as a young teenager in efforts to try to make El Salvador a better place, a country able to provide the basic aspirations of life, economically, socially, culturally, politically, so that nobody, would need to ever flee a beautiful country like El Salvador. And yet I did. And I devoted my life pretty much from the beginning to actually working. First of all, to bring attention to what was happening even as early as the early 1980s, and sadly throughout the years since, And my connection to the story behind this particular movie is one that actually was true 20, 30, 40 years ago, as it is true today. We need to pay attention to the fact that, number one, as a nation, as a matter of governmental policy, the United States of America holds a great deal of responsibility for the conditions that have been created, not only in El Salvador, but in several other countries in the region, including Mexico, that actually force people to migrate. And I do not only mean the level of economic influence that the US exercises in putting in place policies that make very difficult for people to make ends meet, very difficult for people to make sure that they are able to put food on the table for themselves and their families, but also political intervention in these countries that has not ever been really a good example of being on the right side of issues. Even today, I have to sadly say, the United States of America continues to be supportive of essentially a narco government in Honduras. And we know it. We know it because the very brother of the president of Honduras is actually being held in jail in the US precisely because of a sentence related to drug trafficking, which very much involved the brother who happens to be the president of Honduras. So personally for me, the movie, it's about that, about acknowledging that for as long as the conditions that continue to push people to flee countries in Central America, Mexico, we will continue to see people arriving to our borders. But the second reason that makes me so committed to these issues is that we also need to understand that our policies in place today are absolutely inadequate, they are obsolete, and they are very deeply driven by white supremacy and xenophobia. And for as long as our policies are actually driven by prejudicial ideological premises, as opposed to truly humanitarian values and truly smart values, because let's face it, immigrants and immigration historically have been a blessing for the United States of America. And immigrants today are a blessing for the United States of America. We should not be doing what we do at the border. I'm sure that we all saw the images of Haitians in particular being essentially hunted, by white men riding horses going after them. But believe me when I tell you, this is not new. This is something that we've been doing to minors, we've been doing to family groups, we've been doing to people who all they are seeking is protection, support, safe haven from realities that have pushed them out of their countries. And I completely agree, as a matter of overall principle, that the United States needs to be a nation of laws, laws that are actually enforced. But let's also remember that in order to be proud to see our laws be fully enforced, we must first address the degree to which laws are actually based not only on evidence, but based on essential principles of justice. Let me remind you that there was a moment in time when slavery was the law. There was a moment in time when keeping women from exercising their right to vote was the law. And there was a time when casting people aside for different treatment based on their color of their skin was the law. So we must absolutely dare to change the laws in a way that having laws that are indeed something that make us all proud to enforce is something that we can celebrate. That is not the case today. And that's what drives me personally and drives so many Latino immigrant-led organizations not only those associated in Alianza America, but many others, to actually want to be engaged in this particular process. So again, I mean, I have plenty of reasons to why I became involved with this particular film at the time and why I remain very much involved with these issues today. So thank you very much, Judge Donnell, and thank you very much for the American Bar Association for this opportunity to address the fact that sadly, not only lack of economic opportunities, but also lack of safety, lack of basic certainty that one's life can be indeed safe in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, Mexico, is not the reality of today. And we need to therefore keep fighting the good fight for as long as we have to in order to bring about a better tomorrow.
Thank you very much for sharing that perspective. And I am sure that I speak for us all when I say that we are so grateful that you have devoted so much of your efforts to becoming a part of the solution. Let's move on now and let's hear from Ragini Shah.
Thank you so much. And I first want to start by thanking Judge Dornell and Carla McAnders, who is the president of the Immigration Commission of the ABA, for inviting me to be part of this. It's really humbling and such a privilege to be part of this panel, which features the film that Meg helped to produce, and to also be part of a conversation with Raquel and Oscar, whose stories you all just heard, and whose work I followed and have drawn a lot of strength from. So it's really just an honor for me to be a part of this. In terms of my connection to immigration work generally, I direct an immigration clinic where we represent people who are in the process of being deported from the United States. So it's sort of a daily practice for me and my students to work with immigrants. And my interest in immigration law definitely does come from a personal experience with immigration. My parents are immigrants to the United States, but they are some of the people who were lucky enough to benefit from laws in the United States that privilege certain kinds of work. And I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but a lot of the people who are forced to come here do end up engaging in work that is really critical to the functioning, right, of the US economy and US society, but are not acknowledged for that with legal status. And so my parents were very lucky because the kind of work they happened to engage in was credited with that kind of status. And so our immigration story is, I think, very different from people in the film. For me, the connection I had with people in the film is related to work that I've been doing, interviews that I've been doing in Mexico, which are trying to get a sense of why people were leaving particular areas of Mexico. I conducted interviews in about 4 different states, 8 different towns in 4 different states, to try to get a sense of what was really happening in these communities, not just why people are leaving, but also what is the result of all of this migration out of these particular places, and what is really preventing sustainable development in those places. And so the answers are probably not surprising to many of you who are on this webinar, and Oscar alluded to a lot of them already, right? There's very clear intentional economic policies, political programming that comes from the United States, and also involves the elites in, at least, since I only did my research in Mexico, I'll just speak to that. I mean, the elites in terms of the government and the sort of upper echelons of business in Mexico are very much part of creating, right, situation that forces people to leave their home communities in Mexico. And as Raquel mentioned, there's also issues related to climate change. There's also issues related to violence. And again, I know we'll get into this a little bit more later, but I very much saw a lot of what the people I interviewed told me reflected in this film. So I want to thank Meg and the other producers for, putting it into existence. I did not have the opportunity to meet Ginger, and I'm very sad that I didn't, was not able to do that. But I think that what they've all produced together is really a very clear story about what happens when these policies get put into place. Like, what happens to the people who lose from those policies, right? And what they go through to try to make things better. And that very much reflected all of the things that I heard from my interviewees. So it was a real privilege to watch, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Ragini, thank you so much. So you've all just gotten a preview of the depth and the breadth of knowledge on this panel. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and take a deep dive into some of these issues surrounding mass migration. I'm going to start with Meg, because it's clear, Meg, that great care was taken in the film to ensure that the story of the harrowing journey to the United States is told by the migrants themselves, people whose voices often get lost in the chaotic and rancorous debate on immigration policy. So what I'd like you to address is why it was so important for you to share such a nuanced view of the social and economic factors that lead to migration, and why, in the first place, was it so important to raise awareness of the factors that lead to mass migration?
Thank you. Why show a nuanced view? Well, nothing is worth, no issue of controversy in our society is worth a non-nuanced view. And there is so much misunderstanding as why people come to the US and why they risk their lives, even in a nation of immigrants, which is the history of our country, immigrants that were brought here involuntarily or immigrants who made their way voluntarily to the United States, always a complex background into those individual stories. Of course, in Central America, the immigrants are coming for a variety of push factors. And we wanted to help Americans understand the push and pull factors and diminish, as you pointed out, Judge Dornell, to try to diminish the often rancorous debate surrounding immigration. I honestly feel that once people understand the humanitarian approach, the humanitarian understanding, there will be some room for healing and for some solutions to be supported, brought to bear via legislation on the federal, even on the state level. We sought to highlight, again, what makes people leave, how to stem their needs to leave, and show through the personal experience of the migrants themselves, which we have said before, but bears repeating. Why do they do it? At what cost? And of course, we know from experience that the three main reasons that we understand and wanted to share were violence in the countries of origin, poverty, and our understanding also of the development of terrible droughts in Central America. So violence, most people don't understand that the youth homicide rate is 5 times what the World Health Organization considers an epidemic. The youth homicide rate is 5 times what the WHO considers an epidemic in the Northern Triangle of Central America, which of course includes the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And poverty. These same countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, are among the 8 poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, often with a per capita of $1 to $2 a day, maybe $3 a day. And then, of course, we touched on the issue of drought brought on by climate change. Back in just as recently as 2018, a massive drought went through the Central American region, causing 2.2 million people in Central America to lose their crops. And what most Americans don't understand is that most impoverished citizens of the countries in the Northern Triangle are subsistence farmers. They're countries of beautiful geography and, almost bucolic rural environments, but they're extremely dependent upon farming simply for sustenance. And when you're not able to do that, for instance, in Honduras, the rainy season that will support sustenance farming and even production farming, which allows for selling your produce at markets, has decreased from 3 months to 2 months every year. Can you imagine if a third, well, we've experienced this actually, we can imagine in the last 14 months because of the pandemic, but we imagine that if your livelihood were cut off by, at the very least, a third, it would affect tremendously the health and livelihood of your family. And of course, these families are living at very basic subsistence levels. No food produced often means no food eaten. We wanted to show a nuanced view to try to affect some change, not only in the minds, also in the very hearts of people in the United States, to the issues of extreme poverty, of violence, of drought. We also wanted to have people understand through the words of especially the young unaccompanied migrants that children were desperate to seek reunification to their parents who had already immigrated to the United States and had been virtually locked in to the United States via the policies that don't allow for a worker visa program from Central America to the United States. We also wanted to understand the nuances of legal and illegal immigration. The other panelists in this webinar are much more expert to speak to these issues than I, but I'll just touch on the fact that it is very, very difficult for most Americans to understand why migrants don't use legal means to migrate, to immigrate. And as explained in the film, those visas that are required for legal immigration are almost impossible to obtain. We need to look at those reasons that those visas are almost impossible to obtain. We need to look at a better approach to comprehensive immigration reform. We need to ask our legislators to have the courage to really research and support comprehensive immigration reform. But none of that will happen unless average Americans understand the nuanced point of view of most immigrants who come to this country. We were very proud that, for instance, in one screening, it's had just dozens of screenings across the country, but at one screening at a university, a major university, I noticed a young man standing in the back who watched very intently, did not sit down. It was a packed house. There was no standing room only. And in the Q&A session following the film, he was the very last person to raise his hand to offer a question or an observation. He didn't ask a question. He only offered one statement. This film is my life. And it was at that time I realized that we really did depict with integrity the true situation of immigrants from Central America, most especially the unaccompanied minor population. Without that young man's testimony, without the testimony of the immigrants in the film, we would not have awareness in our country across the political divide that stratifies many of our citizens via the very controversial issue of immigration. Without awareness, there is no understanding. Without understanding, there is no empathy. And without empathy, we become even more fragmented as a society. We can't afford that. Once there is a baseline of awareness and empathy, we as individuals often want to take action to make changes, which I know that we'll discuss later in the film. But at the very least, with a greater understanding of why people migrate, why mothers, fathers, and children take great risks to migrate, leaving home and family to seek a better life here, we then are often, again, motivated to treat each other with more respect, to treat those among us, our coworkers, those in our communities, in our places of worship, and those we come into contact with through services provided to us and our families. We come to those interactions more informed and with more respect that is born from a better understanding, which hopefully this film facilitates. These are the reasons that we wanted to show a nuanced view and that we wanted to offer a better understanding of mass migration from Central America.
Thank you, Meg, so much for sharing that background. I'm going to turn next to Raquel Aldana. We've heard from Meg about so many of the factors that motivate people to leave their families and their communities. But these things don't happen in a vacuum. What can you tell us about the historical and some contemporary factors like economic policies or political alliances or development and trade issues that drive these types of migrations?
Thank you. So in December of 2009, immediately before we shut down the borders based on the pandemic, I was visiting my family in the highlands of Guatemala. And I sat down with my husband and a friend who is a long-term environmental justice advocate in Guatemala to write a white paper titled Connecting Past and Present, Central America's Forced Migration as an Unfinished Project of Building Just Nations Post-Colonization and Post-Conflict. So we were writing this white paper at a particularly dark time for Central Americans seeking to emigrate to the US, with President Trump having shut down the border even to asylum seekers, not unlike what had transpired in the 1980s. So in an odd way, the heaviness of the moment liberated us to speak our truth, unconstrained by pragmatism and guided instead by our conviction that we need to frame this discussion of forced migration in the context of the nation's struggles against chronic colonization post-independence. So I want to take some of the ideas that I explored in this paper and elaborate on them in the context of this film. So I'll briefly address two topics. The first is land reform revisited, and the second is migration as reparation. So turning to the first, at the end of the film, you see a small agricultural cooperative in Guatemala, a group of small farmers who, with the assistance from the international community and likely based on some land reforms that were part of the 1996 peace agreements in the country, were starting to participate in the global agroeconomy by producing their own products for exportation. So it's a beautiful story, but one that also has to be placed in a broader context. First, an important observation. Guatemala's agricultural promise is real, even today, after years of pillage of the land, overproduction, deforestation, and now the challenges of water shortages and climate change. What makes it promising is that Guatemala remains a significant agricultural society with enough land to produce and a population with a gift of knowledge and willingness to work the land. According to the World Bank, Guatemala's total land area, 43% is agricultural land and 33% is forested. The rural population comprises 51% of the total population, of which 80% is indigenous, and they are the food growers. In fact, 11% of Guatemala's economy is based on agricultural production. By way of comparison, our own US agricultural production is only 0.6% of our GDP. The significance and beauty of Guatemala as an agricultural society is noticeable when you visit the country, something that is not true for other countries in Central America. Despite massive land displacements and genocide, Guatemala remains rich with an agricultural knowledge and an indigenous culture that preserves traditions that allow it to grow food for local consumption. In contrast, for example, El Salvador, my other homeland, a very small country, was left through land displacements, a monocultural economy bent on producing coffee for exportation, and an early cultural genocide and actual genocide that rendered distinct the indigenous cultures of this small country. It left us with an economy that is dollarized and largely dependent on importation of food from the United States. This food, which is largely subsidized when it is grown in the US to benefit US consumers, becomes prohibitively expensive when it reaches the marketplaces of El Salvador. So you might be asking, why doesn't El Salvador simply grow its own food for local consumption rather than exportation? The reality is that it is nearly impossible to undo the structural reasons that led to a society that is now largely landless and also largely robbed of its ancestral knowledge of food production in an economy that is now largely made up among the vulnerable workers whose only job prospects are working for exploitative industries like maquilas. And yet, despite these odds, these countries have tried to undo these legacies of colonization. Boy, have they tried. Back in the 1940s, what provoked the US ire to interrupt with the CIA and military involvement, the agrarian reform laws that then Guatemalan President Arbenz had put in place, was his boldness, Arbenz' boldness to dare to stand up to the United Fruit Company, the US corporation that had reaped the benefits of Guatemalan corruption, to take over much of the land in Guatemala to exploit workers, yes, to export cheap bananas, yes, for our own consumption. President Arbenz was not proposing to take land without just compensation. The issue was that he would pay in accordance to what was being reported in the tax evaluation of property. And here, the United Fruit Company and other corporations who had strategically undervalued their land in order not to pay taxes suddenly took issue with how their land was being measured and labeled Arbenz a communist. The US decision to listen to United Fruit Company is what began Guatemala's darkest and bloodiest chapter of a 36-year war that most people in Guatemala refer to the Arbenz presidency as the only period of spring. Yes, Guatemala's civil wars, just like El Salvador's and other regions, had a lot to do with land displacement and gluttonous global economies like coffee, sugar, and now palm that are bent on producing cheap products for consumption in a global economy. And this legacy is ongoing and gets in the way of replicating in a meaningful way the beautiful story that you see featured at the end of the film in ways that can truly be sustainable for countries like Guatemala. Today, despite Guatemala's agricultural promise, the land is still inadequately concentrated in the hands of a few. The largest 2.5% of farms occupy nearly 2/3 of agricultural land, while 90% of the farms are only in 1/6 of the agricultural land. Furthermore, tenure of this land is insecure and one of the key causes of poverty among indigenous Guatemalans, who make up more than 50% of the population. The peace agreements attempted to return to land reform, but these reforms were meek. The agreement on socioeconomic issues and agrarian situation did not contain a strategic long-term vision of Guatemala's economic, particularly rural development. The framework adopted was influenced by market-assisted land reform models promoted by international institutions like the World Bank, which focused on strengthening property rights like registration, regularization, and land access, but through voluntary purchase of land, essentially inaccessible to most poor people. One of the main programs that emerged from the peace treaties is this land fund called Fontierras. Its main job was to facilitate this land through credits, so you had to borrow money to be able to purchase land. And the model worked for only a handful of farmers with sufficient resources, good credit, education, skills, to come together to build entrepreneurial models that provide a means to success for a few farmers that are able to compete in the global market. This model remains overly technical, market-driven, and it doesn't begin to address the economic injustices and inefficiency of the deep historical grievances, which are the root causes of past and ongoing rural conflicts. Briefly, another concern I want to highlight is that this promise of Guatemala as an agricultural economy is not being done sustainably because the idea is still to produce food for exportation and not for domestic consumption. to make the small farms profitable, they have to be looking to us, the consumers, outside of their own borders to purchase their products. But this model is terrible for the environment. The transportation of food, right, is not healthy for the environment. It increases the cost of food. And yet Guatemala's main source of income from agricultural production remains this export-based economy. We produce the sugar that we consume, the cereals that we consume, the fruits and vegetables that we consume. In the US, the reason we're able to produce our own food is because agricultural production is heavily subsidized. But the governments of Guatemala don't care to invest in the same way, and trade agreements actually created barriers to be able to subsidize agricultural production in these countries that would produce enough for people to be able to eat. So we also have to think about not just the model of agricultural production, but also thinking about fomenting models that are not for our own benefit. Let's stop exploiting these people to say you have to produce our food in order to survive. Let's start thinking, how do you produce your own food so you don't have to depend on the very expensive products that we want to export to you? For sake of time, I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to elaborate a lot more. One more idea that I want to leave you with is that migration can be a source of reparations. So I've hinted at how much we have intervened into the democratic nation building processes that have caused hundreds of thousands of people literally their lives in these countries. They have fought for so long for liberation, and we have interrupted those projects. And we continue to exploit the workers who come to us by offering them no path to legalization when we ask them to pick our fruits. We call them essential workers in the middle of a pandemic, but we don't think that it is deserving of them to be able to have a path to regularization. And it allows us to consume the cheaper products that we produce in the United States. This is wrong. It is morally wrong. And we actually owe, as a type of reparation, migration as a solution. Why? Because remittances, believe it or not, represent the largest source of economic poverty alleviation in these countries, much largely than any type of foreign aid that we are able to build. It has alleviated extreme forms of poverty for people. The migrants who come to us are very generous people. And for generations, they support families back home who would otherwise have nothing to eat. Even if we're just being pragmatist about this, deporting them is doing nothing to stop the flow of forced migration from those countries. So let's look at legalization as something that we have a moral obligation to do for these people. Thank you.
Raquel, thank you very much for that. It strikes me that if we don't embrace and understand the history, there's no way for us to move forward. We're going to hear next from Oscar Chacon. Oscar, in the film, you talk about the devastation to families and to communities as people are forced to leave in order to escape poverty and corruption and political instability. What role has U.S. foreign policy played in addressing migratory flows, and what recommendations do you have in terms of policies that would better address the problems that are highlighted in the film?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, let me say that I believe Raquel has already addressed a lot of what I could add by way of responding your question. But let me just try to repeat to some degree. I think it's pretty sad that the history of the United States engagement with countries in Latin America in general, but particularly Central American nations and Mexico, is very far away from what anybody would call ideal engagement, in the sense that we have mostly been on the wrong side of issues. We have taken side with very criminal oligarchies. We have taken side with incredibly corrupt military institutions in Central America. We have promoted very actively policies that have literally leave millions of people from any real chance of accessing healthcare, accessing good education, accessing decent housing conditions, and perhaps more importantly, accessing decent jobs with pay that would allow any family to be able to actually live in decent ways. But on top of it, we have also sided with forces that are indeed actively driving people away through the use of violence. And when I say violence, let me clarify that I do not only mean violence in the form of taking a person's life, assassination. I'm talking about attempting against, people's well-being. We forget very easily in the US that in more recent times, when one talks about human rights, we are not talking just about the right not to be killed. We're talking about a much broader set of rights that are constantly violated in many of these countries. So again, our engagement by and large has not been really one that would lead for countries to enjoy ways of life that would indeed make every person in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico to really want to stay home. And I have to also say, to be honest with you, in spite of the very ill-conceived manner in which US policy has been crafted and implemented in these countries, most people in every one of the countries that we are talking about actually do not want to flee, do not want to go away. Why? Because they love their countries. Some people have told me, well, I just don't believe that. I think that if people could, everyone would come here. And I often tell them, look, the state of Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the US. Why do people stay in Mississippi? Why don't they go to New York State? Why don't they go to California? They're free to do that if they wish. And the bottom line is because people from Mississippi loves Mississippi. And that is indeed very similar to the case of people in any one of these countries. They love their countries. They love their weather. They love their food. They love their social ways of, relating to one another, which is very different than they find in the US. But again, I want to emphasize that the history of engagement by the US has been really not exemplary. If you really believe in human rights, if you really believe in the concept of equality, if you really believe in the concept of human rights, we just have not had an exemplary way of connecting to these nations. And clearly, this is driven by the fact that we have for long believed that keeping these countries the way they are is the best way to ensure profit making, for economic interests that are clearly making money out of these conditions. I also want to highlight the fact that in recent times, and I mean literally the last year or so, a conversation has surfaced on the question of can we address the root causes of migration. The Biden-Harris administration has actually spoken in a way that is indeed new, in a way that some may even consider inspiring, in the sense of pointing out that we must address the economic, social, cultural, political factors that are driving people to flee their countries. And I, for one, applauded, such an announcement. I don't believe that we are really doing much of anything new, even though the overall idea was announced and even put into a so-called strategy. But so far, we haven't really done much about it. And I think that that is indeed the right thing to do. I was very happy to actually hear a high-level National Security Council official speak very clearly about why we need to fight back more effectively against corruption in every one of these countries, about the fact that we need to indeed do something new about predatory economic elites in these countries. Believe me when I tell you, for 40 years, I have not heard a US government official saying anything, even remotely close to that. But again, it is not enough to announce these new ideas. You have to follow them with specific actions that make it clear that the US government is indeed interested in a new way of engaging with these countries. And we are pressing very strongly, as much as we can, the US State Department to go beyond beautiful words and actually engaging in the actions that need to be taken. Finally, I want to emphasize very strongly the importance of getting us all to think about what would a new policy regarding humanitarian protection, regarding immigration, above and beyond indeed enabling people to apply for legal permanent residency status in the US, which is what people deserve indeed to be able to have. But I believe that we need to come to grips with the fact that many Americans believe that what is wrong with people arriving is because they are breaking the law. And I want to make it very clear, people do break the law in not such a different way than people challenge discrimination back in the 1960s. So women challenged, through civil disobedience, the fact that they were excluded from participating in the electoral opportunities in our country. So, there have been already several writers throughout Latin America, one in particular I can think of, Jose Luis Rocha, who has actually pointed out that traveling without permission in the conditions that people are doing it is actually an act of necessary civil disobedience. And I think this should call into question our ability to actually deeply move us away from a policy that is strongly driven, as I mentioned earlier, by white supremacy, strongly driven by profound xenophobic prejudice, and finally understand that immigration, all of them, have been extremely positive for the US and extremely positive for their own countries of origin. If we were to embrace those truths, I believe that we should be able to dare to propose an entirely brand new policies that truly honor the principle of humanitarian protection, of welcoming people, because that's exactly what we should be doing with people from Haiti, from Central American countries, from Mexico, that are trying to not do anything harmful to anybody, but simply helping them improve their own lives, and in the process, improve also the life of the United States of America. I truly believe that these things are possible if we dare to break away with narratives that are essentially based on lies and also based on prejudice, such as white supremacy and xenophobia.
Thank you very much, Oscar. I especially appreciated your analysis. The late John Lewis would probably refer to it as being good trouble. We're going to move on now to hear from Ragini Shah. While most of the coverage of migrants that we see coming to the United States is focused on people from the Northern Triangle countries, the film A Bridge Apart also focuses on the migration of Mexican nationals to the United States. And given what you have described earlier, given your multi-generational and multi-year ethnographic study in Mexico, can you talk a little bit about what the forces are that drive Mexican nationals to depart and in some cases to return?
Absolutely. And thank you, Judge Dornell, for that question. I would say that my research really confirms a lot of what, if people were able to see the film, what the film shows, right? Which is that there are very deep-seated economic reasons why people are leaving. I do want to say, before I get into specific findings that I made, that my research was in 4 different states in Mexico: Puebla, Tlaxcala, Tabasco, and Oaxaca. And while some of those states do experience some of the violence that some of you may have heard about in Mexico, the specific communities that I visited were not experiencing this violence firsthand. So One thing I do want to say is that a lot of people leave Mexico because they're fleeing from violence. They are fleeing either violence by the state, they're fleeing violence because of organized crime, they're fleeing violence, familial violence, or they're fleeing violence because of, you know, a characteristic that they have. Maybe they're lesbian or gay, maybe they're transgender. So, you know, a lot of the reasons that people flee any part of the world are also reasons that Mexicans flee. I think we often think of people who migrate from Mexico as only coming for economic reasons. And I'd hate for my research to just, you know, continue that stereotype, right? I did happen to talk to people who really did have what I would call economic reasons for migrating, but there are a number of people who also do come to the United States because they are fleeing violence. So just want to put that out there. So within those 4 states where I conducted research, there were 3 main things that people talked about as reasons that they left. And before I talk about the specific reasons that they mentioned, I do want to say that, you know, just drawing on what Oscar and Raquel have already talked about, all of the reasons that people mentioned are things that have been created by economic policies, right? So it's not like these are just natural conditions that exist, but there are very specific economic policies that created the conditions that people then reported to me were the reasons why they left. So one of the primary reasons that people reported to me in all 4 of those states was that they left in order to give their children an education. And we're talking about a public education, right? So people are trying to send their children to public school, but public schools in most parts of Mexico charge fees. And why do they charge fees? Because education spending in Mexico has been gutted. And the main reason that it has been gutted is because of a set of internationally prescribed economic policies that call for reducing public spending, right? So it's part of a set of policies that people refer to as neoliberal economic policies. And those policies were essentially, in some ways, although in the case of Mexico, it's a little bit more nuanced than this, but essentially these sets of policies were forced on most governments in exchange for accepting much needed loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And in the case of Mexico, direct loans from the United States. Now, the reason I say it's a little more nuanced in the case of Mexico is because the Mexican government in the 1980s, when a lot of this was happening, the ruling parties were neoliberal themselves. So they actually sort of embraced a lot of this cut to public expenditures themselves. So they weren't really forced in the same way, but it was certainly forced on the people who ended up at the losing end. So the cuts in public education came about as a result, cuts in funding rather to public education came about as a result of these economic policies. Now you have people who are having to pay to send their children to school. One of the other issues that came up was also having to pay for transportation for their children to go to school. So in very small rural communities, there might be a primaria, which is the equivalent of like an elementary school, but there wouldn't be a secundaria or middle school or a preparatoria, which is high school. And so those children would have to commute very long distances, and there's no public transportation for school. So they would have to pay, essentially parents would have to get together and pay private taxis to send their kids to school. So imagine that all you're trying to do is educate your children, but you can't meet that expense. And so you are willing then to pay somebody to get you into the United States so that you can send back enough money for essentials, but also in order to pay for your kids to be able to go through school. One thing I will say about that is, you know, and Judge Dornell referred to a lot of my work was intergenerational. So I did talk to parents, but I also talked to the children who benefited from their parents' migration. And unfortunately, one of the other issues in Mexico, which has been created, is a lack of stable jobs, right? So there's a lot of development of contingent jobs, like jobs in what are called maquiladoras, which are essentially factories that assemble, I shouldn't say produce, but assemble goods to then be sold in the United States. So there's US companies who will send sort of parts to various assembly plants in Mexico, have them assembled there because it is cheaper for the US company. And then those same products will come back into the US to be sold here. So there's literally no money being made on this in Mexico other than the wages of the people who work in the assembly plants. And those wages are quite low and are actually kept quite low by agreement between the US and Mexico. And the jobs are very unstable because at any moment, the company might decide it's cheaper to produce in some other country. And so they will actually leave. And so unfortunately, for a lot of the young people who did manage to get a high school diploma because of their parents' sacrifice, they were not able to pull themselves into a position where they had some economic stability. So a lot of the young people migrated themselves to the United States. And then a second reason that a lot of people gave for leaving was because they could not make money from their land. And this is something that Meg referred to when she was talking about, a lot of the people in the film, right, who are subsistence farmers. A lot of the people I interviewed were also subsistence farmers, but even with subsistence farming, some of those folks had enough land and were trying to make a living, right, from some of the products that they were able to sell. But the problem with being able to make a living from farming in Mexico is that at the same time that education funding was cut, all subsidies to agriculture were cut over the course of several years. But between 1980 and 1996, all agricultural subsidies essentially terminated in Mexico. So farmers were left trying to produce. And for those of you who know anything about farming, it's really impossible to do farming without some kind of money up front, right? You need some money up front to be able to invest and then you need the person who invested the money in you to wait to be repaid when you harvest and are able to sell your produce. So that has resulted in a really mass migration out of particularly Oaxaca and Tabasco, where most of the people that I interviewed were farmers, because they just simply could not afford to make ends meet anymore from the land that they owned. And then a third reason that a lot of people gave was a lack of work. And I think I already referred to this when I talked about, some of the young people who did manage to get a high school diploma, but then could not find a stable job. And so they themselves had to migrate. The lack of stable work is also something that was very much created, and it's rooted in a deeper history than just the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank from the 1980s. But those policies really did kind of exaggerate and accelerate the process of disinvestment from a number of different communities. So industries that existed in communities like Tlaxcala had a very vibrant community that was producing textiles, really beautiful textiles that were sought out in other parts of Mexico, completely disappeared and instead were replaced by these maquiladoras that now just assemble clothing, like for the Gap and Forever 21 and these companies that do like fast fashion. And so you really see, the number of different ways in which the economy of Mexico was completely gutted. And then on top of that, then once you had, over a decade of this sort of gutting of the economy, you then have the US, Mexico, and Canada signing NAFTA in 1994. And what NAFTA does is then force the markets in Mexico to open up to US produce. And as Raquel mentioned, right, farm products in the US are subsidized. And so now the subsidized products in the US are competing with unsubsidized products in Mexico. And again, this is a much longer history than just NAFTA, but you essentially have a glut of US products coming into Mexico and making it even worse for the farmers who lost their subsidies than it even was in the 1980s. So there's quite a lot of US involvement in all of the factors that were pushing people to leave. One thing I'll just say before I talk a little bit about, what I think might be a potential solution is that, Judge Dornell, you asked me about why people leave Mexico, but then why they also then return to Mexico. And so one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that a lot of the folks that I interviewed anyway came and worked in agriculture, worked in food production, worked in construction, industries that are really heavy labor and industries where physically it is very difficult to continue working for decades and decades and decades. So although a lot of the people that I interviewed were in a position, as Meg alluded to earlier, where, because of US enforcement policies that, essentially make it very difficult for people to cross the border easily, and then also make it, other immigration policies that make it very difficult to remain in the US legally and do all the kinds of work I described. It meant that a lot of people did remain in the US for longer than they expected to, right? So they would remain, they thought maybe they would come for 4 or 5 years, but they ended up staying for 10, 12, 15 years. But at a certain point, the work that they were doing in the US, they just physically couldn't do it anymore. So there were a number of people that I met who had returned to their hometowns in Mexico and were trying to figure out a different way of doing things just because they just physically couldn't do the work that they had been doing in the US anymore. And so there were a lot of organizations sort of turning to what I think might be a potential way of acknowledging the US role in all of this instability and all of this, what I would call extraction, really, right? From, and what, Raquel called extraction in the title of her book, right? All of the extraction from these migrant sending communities, not just the people, but also the resources, right? Because the US does extract, right, natural resources from these countries, extracts profit from land. In Mexico, 80% of the arable land is actually owned by US corporations. And so all of this extraction, right, by the US needs to compensate, I think, the communities for what it has done. So a lot of people I spoke to kind of echoed what Oscar mentioned about wanting to remain in their home communities. They really didn't want to leave. And many of the family members who hadn't seen their relatives in a number of years spoke really movingly about how difficult it is to, essentially what they called it was family disintegration, right? So it wasn't even separation from their family. It was the family unit had really just kind of fallen apart because of this extended absence of several members of their family. And so while I do think that it is important for the US immigration policies to reflect the people who are coming here and who are working here and who are supporting the US economy, I also think the US needs to take some accountability for the amount that we have extracted from these communities and compensate the communities for that. And I would say compensate the communities directly, not through foreign aid, through governments, because that really hardly ever trickles down into communities. I also think that some of the things that the Biden administration and that the Obama administration thought about in terms of addressing root causes, I think what really needs to happen is a mind shift, right? Because the mindset in the United States is always about security and how can we make these places more secure, right? And what they really mean is how can we fund the military and the police and all of these enforcement agencies? So US funding to Mexico is huge. It is, nearly $1 billion a year, but it is not for addressing the economic conditions that US policies have created. It is in order to fund the military and the police and the immigration agency to start doing some immigration enforcement work for us. And so you have $1 billion on one side spent in Mexico on security. Also, obviously, a lot of that money is also spent to try to combat drug trafficking, although there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it doesn't really combat drug trafficking. What it really does is exacerbates the violence that's caused by drug trafficking, right? Because when you have violent reaction to organized crime, you're going to get violent reaction from organized crime. And so, I think what needs to happen is a change in the mindset where we're not thinking only about funding for security, but really thinking about what if we took that $1 billion and actually invested it in communities, the communities that we have been partly responsible for the disinvestment from. What could those communities do with that money? A lot of the communities I visited had very vibrant, locally rooted movements that were looking for alternatives to migration, and they were creating co-ops, much like what was shown in the film. They were creating women's organizations. They were trying to, make use of indigenous knowledge for herbal medicines and other kinds of products. And those are the kinds of things that if you invested in communities directly, that they could make use of and spend in a way that is sustainable and useful for their own communities, as opposed to, what the state or the city or the federal government might think was useful. So those are just some thoughts I have, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Ragini, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing these thought-provoking insights. And just a reminder that this program contains a link to all of the scholarship that has been referenced. Please feel free to ask questions of the panelists through the Q&A function. Before we get to those questions, I want to circle back for a moment to Meg with a question about the film. Meg, you referenced the film as being a call to action. So what can people do as individuals? What can local and state organizations, both public and private, do to raise awareness and to pursue solutions? Because that's what people really want to know, right? What can they do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a number of things to do. I'm going to focus on 3 simple ones because I know folks often can be deluged by statistics and organizations and so forth. So I just tried to think of 3 simple things. Number 1, part of what you're doing today is educating yourself. I'm not sure of the profile of our typical participant, but I bet there are a bunch of university students that are involved in our webinar today. So you're on the first step to educate yourself about some of these issues in forums like the ABA webinar, obviously. Research, this is elementary, but research websites of organizations that we've referenced and that we will reference. Especially make yourself aware of the very good research and resources they have in their websites relative to immigration. So for instance, there are organizations like Interaction, which is an alliance of international organizations that partner together to eliminate extreme poverty, but they're very involved in immigration and migration issues. Interaction has Catholic Relief Services, CARE, Save the Children, et cetera, a number of very good organizations that ally together to advocate on behalf of these issues before the federal government. So if you are aware of what they are prioritizing, then you can prioritize that with your individual's legislator, a congressman, congresswoman, senator. You also, there are other good organizations, including Lutheran Refugee Services, the USCCB, which is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office on Migration and Refugee Services, is an exemplary organization for advocacy and has a great website that articulates the issues of immigration and migration that relate to current legislation before Congress. So when you educate yourself, then you can advocate for the immigration issues, having been informed. And then in addition to education, within education, if you want to hold a screening for the film, I think it's a very palatable tool for education. Most people, it's 56 minutes, under an hour. And since it comes from the point of view of the migrants themselves, it really does strike a chord with audiences. I've seen that nationwide. We've already held screenings at Georgetown, at Fordham, University Santa Clara, a number, I'm just forgetting the other ones, but around the country. And many civic groups, many faith groups have held screenings in their parishes or synagogues. Even, mosque or Islamic community has been very interested in the issue of immigrations writ large as well. So educate, advocate after you've learned through your education efforts with your legislators. And then thirdly, I would encourage you to support through your own volunteer work or through financial support organizations in your local community that do really good work with asylum seekers, immigration and migration, attorneys, et cetera. And then there's a wonderful network of social service agencies that I have more familiarity with because I worked for CRS, that is Catholic Charities throughout the United States. Almost every major city, Los Angeles, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, DC, New York, Miami, has a really good social justice service, immigration, migration, refugee services within their local Catholic charities. And of course, I would encourage you to support Oscar's organization. We have great affection and respect for Alianza Americas and the work that he's doing. We can offer links to these organizations in follow-up materials. If you would like that, Judge Dornell, I'd be happy to provide that information. If you have any questions or a desire to hold a screening, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm at Meg Barrett 42@gmail.com, and we'd be happy to entertain that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to circle back to something that Oscar alluded to earlier, given that a theme that our presenters have discussed relates to justice for people who come to our borders. We saw the disgusting images of the Haitian migrants at the border with the terrible images of the Border Patrol agents chasing them down on horseback. My question is to all of the panelists: how do the conversations that we have about the experiences of Mexican and Central American migrants implicate our nation's treatment of people of African descent, be they Haitians or Afro-Latinos or people from African nations? In other words, how are Black migrants treated in comparison to migrants of other races, and what do we need to address this?
Would you like me to respond to that question?
Yes.
Well, let me be very clear. U.S. immigration policy, as it has been very widely and carefully documented by many scholars, not the least of them May Nye, has always been, sadly, an area of policy profoundly influenced by white supremacists and deeply xenophobic prejudice. You can look pretty much from the beginning, and the fact is very clear. I mean, the evidence is very clear. We didn't really like people who were not white. And sometimes we didn't even like other white people, that were not purely Anglo-Saxon, in terms of their ancestry. And it is as a result of this sad history that the darker your skin color is, the worse you are likely to be treated. So while I completely was appalled, by the images that we saw of white men riding horses, hunting literally Haitians, I also was not surprised, because this is exactly what has been happening over the years. And to be fair, people of specifically countries with an either dominant, black population or significant numbers of black population usually fare even worse. I mean, that is just a fact, But I also want to make sure that we understand the vast majority of the people profoundly affected by an immigration law that is deeply driven not only by the prejudices I already mentioned, but by the principles of exclusion, restriction, and punishment are actually people from Mexico. All you need to look at is who makes up the majority of the people deported over the past 40 years, just to take a period of time. Who are the people who end up in detention on a nightly basis, by and large, in our country? They happen to be Mexicans. And the people among several that are in line to wait the longest whenever they actually qualify for immigration benefits in the context of a horrible overall immigration policy we now have in place are also Mexicans. But again, I think it's important to highlight how full of hypocrisy, we are, as a nation, our policymakers. You may have read this morning's New York Times, basically pointing to the reality of Haiti today and how the reality of Haiti is one of deeply, deeply insecurity, for everybody, but especially in light of, the sad kidnapping that we saw recently. And in this respect, I think it is very important to know that in as heartbreaking as that story in the New York Times was, that is the reality that our president, our vice president, our secretary of Homeland Security continue to believe, that it is a safe condition for us to keep sending people from Haiti back to. So clearly, we have a lot to account for in terms of the treatment that we give to people who are especially coming from, again, predominantly Afro makeup in terms of racial makeup. And this is not only true at our southern border, but it's also true throughout the migratory route that many of these migrants have to go through. So again, going back to the issue, yes, the darker your skin is, the worse you will fare. And again, keep in mind, Mexicans have been by and large the largest victims, even to the point that we don't acknowledge their minor migrants to have the same rights that we have granted in the past to others. They don't even are considered serious applicants for asylum, for the simple reason that we just don't want to acknowledge that a lot of things are broken in a place like Mexico, which, by the way, also has Afro-descendant population, not always recognized, but they're surely there.
Thank you very much for that. Does anyone else want to address that?
Perhaps I'll just remind us, Judge Dornell, that some of the most disturbing policies in the context of asylum, and specifically that really contested the principle of non-refoulement, which is the protection against being returned back to dangerous situations, really began with the rise in Haitian migration to the United States. So it has been pointed out as a specific example where what Oscar has been detailing for us, the interrelationship between racial policies and immigration policies. That's one historical example where it was quite evident in the way that we interdicted Haitians at sea, in contrast perhaps to the ways in which we responded to differently to Cuban Americans. Of course, the explanations are not solely racial in terms of Cuba, because Cuba also has a very large Afro-descendant population. But the revolution in Cuba, and the people who were originally fleeing from Cuba were people who, for reasons that have to do also with racialized experiences of colonization and nation building, right, were the whiter Cubans who felt displaced by the Cuban Revolution. And therefore, it had not been an expression, a migration that had been the darker Cubans until perhaps more recently. So we saw this dynamic play out at sea in very visible ways, and I think it also led at that time to conversations around the racialized nature of immigration against African Americans.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, it looks like we are out of time for today. These are such important and compelling issues. We could probably discuss them for hours, and we are so fortunate to have all of these learned panelists to help us to understand these issues. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each of our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise today as we try to understand these complicated issues that surround mass migration. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this free webinar. I encourage you once again to view the film, A Bridge Apart, and to share a recording of this program with your networks. The Commission on Immigration provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. You can find more information at our website at www.americanbar.org/immigration. And if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the American Bar Association. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judge Dornell. Thank you, everyone.